so then yes, anytime you want to spend from that fund, you have to ask the voters to take the money out.
Right, but it is a general, so you...
Yeah, but it is a general fund, but not really, because when you established it, you said it had to be for purposes in the capital improvements program, so you are restricted by the capital improvements
So we are
plan.
okay with that.
Yeah, I have no problem with that. I feel like I've heard of this before.
Yeah.
So
I mean, we're very good. You know,
yep.
we hold public hearings on the capital improvement project plan, and you know, we publish
I think that's legitimate because you are still restricted by it, and you can only spend that it's consistent with the plan.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
So this is just an example of well, what's wrong with this warrant article? Why did I put this up here?
It's too specialized.
Yes. It's too specific, right? So sometimes, remember that in appropriation you're asking the voters for authorization to spend money, and sometimes what happens is your desire to be really clear with the voters that we really are going to spend money for a particular purpose can turn into we have restricted ourselves so much that we literally can't spend money for this purpose. So you have a warrant article to buy a very particular truck, and you appropriate, and you plan that out in February, and then when you get it in March, that truck doesn't exist anymore, and now you've actually boxed yourself in. So it's important with the drafting of warrant articles to think, yes, what do we want to spend the money for, because we want to tell the voters that we are spending it on some legitimate purpose, but we also need some flexibility so that when it comes time to actually get that money, it's time to spend it, we can both effectuate the purpose but also do it consistent with the conditions at the time that we go to spend the money. And that's really all the point I was trying to make it there. So earlier I talked a little bit about procedural requirements for appropriations, and again we're talking about procedural requirements for the money that we ask the voters to authorize us to spend. And I said that, you know, if you don't follow the procedure, appropriations can basically not be valid and can be disallowed by the Department of Revenue. And so these are the very basic requirements that have to be met in order for appropriations to be valid. Again, talking about the operating budget and talking about any separate and special warrant articles containing appropriations. You have to have at least one budget hearing, and I'm going to go through these in more detail. You have to disclose the purpose and amounts of those appropriations at the budget hearing. You're required to budget on a gross basis. There are requirements for the Budget Committee and the Select Board to recommend and or not recommend particular appropriations. There's the requirement for warrant notice to the public of what they're going to be voting on. And that applies not just to appropriations, but to all subject matter that they're going to be voting on. And then there is the requirement that appropriations be listed. So you've got appropriations and separate articles all listed essentially as separate warrant articles on the budget. So let's look at some of these in turn. This is a really important one. Is the budget hearing requirement. So there has to be at least one budget hearing, and the budget hearing has to include the operating budget, and it has to include all of those other separate articles containing appropriations. In addition, now that you are an SB2 town, there is a very strict requirement under 40 Section 13 that your first budget hearing must include disclosure of the default budget. That has to happen at the first budget hearing. Now, is the Select Board responsible for the default budget, or was it delegated to the Budget Committee? That would have to be done by the voters.
It was just a generic warrant article that said we want to be an SB2 town.
Perfect. So the way that it works is that when a town transitions to SB2, even though the Budget Committee still does the proposed budget for adoption to the voters, it is the Select Board that creates the so-called default budget.
And it has to be
disclosed at the first budget hearing under 40 Section 13. It's really important. And the first budget hearing is going to be earlier than you're used to, because of the deadlines being pushed back because of the deliberative session. The default budget in very general terms, and I'm sure you'll have questions on this as the year goes on.
You'll be hearing from us.
It's just in very general terms. You know, again, there's a lot of legislation happening right now to change some of these requirements of the default budget. But the default budget is supposed to be last year's budget, reduced or increased, as the case may be, for one-time expenditures, or other contractual obligations, or other mandated expenditures by law. So what you're supposed to do essentially is as a select board, is take last year's budget, and if there are any expenditures within that budget that were one time, meaning they're not expected again this year, they come out, or if there are any contractual obligations that were expenditures that were adopted by the voters, those can go into the default budget. But other than those sort of tweaks here and there, the default budget generally looks like last year's budget, okay? And that's sort of a very broad overview of it. But the idea here is that because the voters go to the polls to vote on the budget, if they vote no on the budget committee's operating budget, something has to go into effect for the budget. And so if the budget committee proposes a $2.5 million operating budget and it fails, automatically your default budget that you calculated based on last year's budget is going to go into effect. Now, there is an ability to hold a special meeting just to reconsider the operating budget if the operating budget doesn't pass, but generally what happens is when voters don't adopt the operating budget, you go into a default budget year.
When do you anticipate that the legislature will have made its...
Soon.
Okay.
Very soon. You know, I think that you should, you know, get in touch with us in the summer months when we can give you some better ideas. One of the big, not to go on a total tirade about, or go off track here about default budgets, but one of the things that's been happening a lot with default budgets is that voters are believing that towns and school districts are putting things into the default budget that are not supposed to be there. So again, the default budget is last year's budget, but there are some things that were only in last year's budget because they were spent just last year and you don't need them again this year. But maybe, you know, last year the voters adopted a multi-year contract, and so you would put that expenditure into the default budget because it was properly adopted. So while there are things that have to be taken out or put in, voters were seeing that boards were putting things into the default budget that really were proper for the proposed operating budget, but really were not appropriate for the default budget. And I'm going to give you an example. There was, just a couple months ago, there was a town where the select board had agreed to a contract for an employee that had some pretty substantial annual raises going forward. And the town, this was an agreement with the employee. It wasn't necessarily agreed to as a multi-year appropriation by the voters. But when the select board calculated the default budget, because they, as the select board, had signed a contract with the employee, they automatically put in the additional $30,000 raise that this person was supposed to get. And a resident sued the town and said, that's not a contract. Just because the board entered into a contract during the budget year, that doesn't obligate the town to that additional amount, which wouldn't obligate it to go into the default budget. And the court sided with the resident and said that this was not a proper increase to add into the default budget. So while they could put it into the proposed budget that they were hoping to have adopted, it was not a proper addition to the default budget because it wasn't in last year's operating budget. Now keep in mind that doesn't prohibit the selectmen from giving the employee the raise, but they have to do it within, if they go into a default year, they have to do it within the bottom line default budget. So that has really spurred a lot of legislation about what is an appropriate contractual obligation to put into the default budget.
Might it also be possible if that employee sues the town because the employee thinks he or she has it?
Yep, it's possible. And so, but again, that's a spending question for the, really, I think, for the select board, whether that money can be found in the budget. Yeah.
But you also, if you were unionized, you would have to obligate that.
So this was not a contract that went to the voters who said, yes, we agree to this 3-year contract with these increases. a collective bargaining agreement, whenever let's say the school board and the union reach an agreement, there's one more step that has to happen, and that is that the cost of the agreement has to go to the voters in a separate warrant article, and they have to adopt it. And once they say, yes, we agree to the monetary terms of this collective bargaining agreement, those monetary amounts go into all subsequent budgets, including the default budget, because it's a previously approved contract by the legislative body.
Okay.
So I went on a default budget sidetrack just so you would know that that's part of your responsibility. Yeah, and so the important thing about the budget hearings is that you have to have at least one, and you have to discuss or disclose all purposes and amounts of appropriations. And basically what this means, in addition to disclosing the default budget, is that the proposed budget of the budget committee needs to be, presented to the voters, as do any other separate warrant articles that contain appropriations. So that's all the articles that the select board may have drafted that contain appropriations, and that also includes any petitioned warrant articles, which means it is often wise to schedule the first budget hearing to be immediately after the deadline for the presentation of petitioned warrant articles. Because if you schedule your first budget hearing before petitioned warrant articles are due, and then someone submits a petitioned warrant article with an appropriation, you are going to be obligated to have another budget hearing, even if it's just for that warrant article. Now, you can have as many budget hearings as you want up until the time that you have to finalize and post the budget. So, you have your first budget hearing, and maybe you realize that there's a lot of work to be done and you should have another hearing on it, and that's perfectly fine. You basically have up until the deadline that the budget needs to be finalized in order to do that. The key is that you have to either disclose or discuss all purposes and amounts of appropriations, which means if you have a budget hearing, you have to at minimum make the public aware of the proposed appropriations and the amounts of those appropriations. If after the budget hearing there is a new amount that the budget committee would like to propose, or a new warrant article with an appropriation that the selectmen would like to propose, or a petitioned warrant article that comes in with a new amount, you have to have a new budget hearing, because that amount or purpose has not been disclosed or discussed at a budget hearing. You can, after a budget hearing, decrease amounts of appropriation. So after the budget hearing, the budget committee could decrease lines in the budget, but you can't increase amounts. So let's say after the budget hearing you decide you need to insert another $50,000 into the operating budget. You would be obligated to have another budget hearing because you are increasing the amount, and that increase wasn't disclosed or discussed at a former budget hearing.
Let me make sure I fully understand.
Sure.
So after the public hearing on the budget committee will then make its final determination on the budget, at which time they can decrease.
They could decrease
from
amounts,
the operating
yes.
budget, not the warrants. They can decrease, but they may not increase.
Because basically what they've done, if you've disclosed, for example, a $50,000 appropriation, that also means that you've disclosed it could be less than that. But what you haven't disclosed is that it could be more than that. And the voters need to have a public hearing on that going into the deliberative session prior to that, when they have the budget hearing. So that's important to just keep in mind. If there's going to be increases or new warrant articles or new purposes or amounts of appropriations, then there would have to be additional budget hearings. Good to schedule the first budget hearing right after the petitioned warrant articles are due, but not too late, because you want to save time in order for you to have additional budget hearings if necessary.
I just want to, so John, we will make sure that that the budget committee gets all the dates. The Municipal Association puts out a calendar of all of the appropriate dates and windows and thresholds and whatnot. So we'll make sure that is available to the budget committee and to us as we try to schedule this new SB2 scheduling?
Yes, so we do every year a calendar of important dates for all the different towns based on what their town meeting is. So you'll be able to see what is, the last, the first day to have my budget hearing, what's the last day for petition warrant articles, when is the first day for the deliberative session. You'll see all those dates so that you're able to schedule everything accordingly. And again, 32.5 is a really important statute. We're going to talk a lot about 32.5. We are talking a lot about 32 Section 5. But some of the things that you would have formerly read in 32 Section 5, you're now going to be reading in 40 Section 13 because that is the SB2 statute. So those are sort of the basics of appropriations. We need legislative body approval. We talk about operating budget versus separate warrant articles, the requirement for the budget hearings in order for appropriations to be valid. And now just sort of a brief word on what I mean by gross basis budgeting, which is our second sort of key concept of budget law. And really all I mean is when we think about a warrant article, to see if think about our Ford, our black Ford truck. A warrant article needs to state the purpose for which the money is going to be spent. It needs to state the grand total that you're asking for. And then the key to gross basis budgeting is it has to state all the sources from which you're raising that money and the amount to come from each one of those sources. So if the truck that you need for public works is going to be $5,000 from taxation and $25,000 from the Public Works Equipment Capital Reserve Fund, you've got to state $25,000 from the reserve fund, $5,000 from general taxation, and the total is $30,000. And that's really just the key to gross basis budgeting. Department of Revenue will not guess at what you meant. But that being said, if you drafted that warrant article to say $30,000 for the purchase of a truck with $25,000 to come from the Capital Reserve Fund, I think it would be presumed that the $5,000 would be coming from general taxation. But really, you should strive to clearly say every single source of money, how much is coming from it, and make sure that all of those sources add up to your total amount that you're seeking to appropriate. And that's really sort of the key to gross basis budgeting. This includes revenue, so if you're appropriating revenue that's come in, or maybe you're appropriating money from the general fund, you didn't spend it, you had $100,000 at the end of the year that was left over in your budget, if you want to take some of that to spend on a new purpose for this year, you've got to state that you're appropriating that money and that you're going to be spending it for a purpose in the new budget year. So in addition to the requirement that you state all the sources from which the money is coming and you state the amounts from all of those sources, there's also an obligation to put recommendations or non-recommendations on warrant articles. So all of these warrant articles that contain an appropriation or a monetary amount, we have to think about whether we're obligated to put our recommendation on the warrant article. The general rule is that the Budget Committee and the Select Board must put their recommendation or non-recommendation on all special warrant articles. So this really is the third reason why we care about whether a warrant article is a special warrant article, is because the default rule is that the recommendations of the Budget Committee and the Select Board must go on to special warrant articles. Now that being said, many towns in the past went a step further and voted to require that the numeric tallies of votes of the Budget Committee and the Select Board be placed on all warrant articles containing an appropriation, regardless of whether they are special. And so most towns you will see both the recommendation or non-recommendation of the Select Board and the Budget Committee on every warrant article that contains an appropriation. And you'll also generally see the numeric tally, 2-to-1 recommendation by the Select Board for this article. This authority is found under 32 Section 5, but it also applies to SB2 municipalities. The same exact language about recommendations of warrant articles is found in 40 Section 13. There are just corollaries to 32.5. So I don't know what Rollinsford does. Do you have a recommendation on all monetary warrant articles, whether
It's
special
just-
or not? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And it's just a yes or no because we never passed the.
The numeric tallies,
Correct.
okay. As a sort of side note, the way that numeric tallies are adopted is either the town meeting votes to require numeric tallies, or the governing body, you guys actually have authority to vote at a public meeting that we're going to require numeric tallies, as long as the town meeting didn't vote in the past not to require it. So you can't go against their prior vote, but if they haven't voted on it, you can require it in the first instance. This applies to articles with appropriations, so what sometimes is referred to as budgetary articles. The Budget Committee has no ability to put its recommendation or non-recommendation on warrant articles that do not contain appropriations, because the Budget Committee's authority is recommending to the voters what should be appropriated. The Select Board has inherent authority to put its recommendation on all warrant articles, even warrant articles that don't contain appropriations. That was actually challenged a couple years ago, and it reached the New Hampshire Supreme Court, and they said, yes, the Select Board can do more than just recommend monetary warrant articles. They can recommend other warrant articles as the case may see fit. Has the town previously voted to require the estimated tax impact?
No.
Okay, so I won't even get into that. That is something the town would have to vote to do in the first instance.
It's been very helpful for the DRA to provide to us.
Yep.
You know, a listing of those kinds of
Yes.
warrant articles that have been passed.
So
and
did
it
you go to
stated-
DRA and get your permanent record?
Yes.
Is that to see what the town had
We
voted?
print it in the annual report
Good.
every year so people can see what
Good.
it is.
I think that's important. But we won't even get into that. We will move on to concept number 3, which is the requirement that all appropriations be noticed to the public, and that's via the warrant.
Can I
Yes.
just ask a quick
Yeah.
question? So, I know you're not gonna get into it, but what would be the difficulty in having something like that, the tax impact on a warrant article? Like, what's the process?
There's no real difficulty. The way that it works is if the voters can adopt a warrant article that says, yes, we want the tax impact on any warrant article that potentially has a tax impact. And once that's adopted, basically it's the Select Board's obligation to put an estimated tax impact statement on each warrant article. And if the Select Board doesn't do it, they delegate it to someone else to do it. And then basically they're the ones who say, yes, this is, we say, yes, this is the estimated tax impact. All it is an estimate. It obviously can't say for sure what the impact will be. And the other really crucial thing for voters to understand is that we only know the tax rate from last year at the point that we are adopting our budget for this year. So it really is based on last year, and that can have play a huge role in how close the estimate is or not. But it's not a crazy process. It really is just a way for the voters to say, yes, we'd like some additional calculations to be done to estimate to us what we're looking at as far as an impact on our tax rate. And frankly, I think it can pull both ways. Sometimes voters will look and the amounts can be so minimal that they see $50,000, which sounds like a lot, but then they see the impact on the tax rate and it's so minimal that sometimes it can be a positive for the town to pass appropriations. So it's something that the Select Board could put on the warrant, and it's something that citizens could come together and do a petition to put on the warrant. And then you just be required, the Select Board would just be required to do that estimate. So the main requirement for really all subject matter, whether we're talking about an appropriation or we're talking about anything else that you want the voters to vote on, all must be warned, meaning it must be noticed by posting it on the town warrant prior to the deliberative session and then prior to the voting day. And the statutes that really deal with this there are a number of statutes that deal with it. 39 Section 2 is just the generic statute that says everything you want to act on, the subject matter and all appropriations need to be posted on the warrant so that the voters have notice of what they are going to be talking about and acting upon at the town meeting. 32 Section 6 very clearly says that an appropriation is only valid if it appeared on the warrant. Now, it's also very clear under various other statutes, that just because an appropriation appeared on the warrant as one amount does not bar the voters from amending it to be a different amount. So the voters get notice that of this warrant article for $50,000. They had, notice of it at the budget hearing. Now they have warrant notice of it. But when they get to the deliberative session, it's fair game, and you're expected to turn out. And if you want to make it less, or you don't want it to be made less, or you don't want it to be made to be more, then you're expected to turn out and have a say in it. And so the voters have the ability to decrease or increase appropriations at the deliberative session, make those amendments just like they would otherwise have the authority to do at a traditional town meeting. There is no difference in their ability to amend and decrease and increase amounts. And as an aside, even though this isn't budget related, voters still have the same general authority to amend this, warrant articles, as long as they don't eliminate the subject matter or entirely change the subject matter of the warrant article. They can still change the wording of warrant articles in addition to decreasing and increasing appropriations in separate warrant articles. That is still what they can do at the deliberative session. The stay-at-home rule is really just sort of this funny concept where if you're trying to say, did we appropriately notice this subject matter that we're acting on, the question is, if I looked at the warrant, would I know whether I wanted to come out based on the subject matter that's on the warrant, or if I read this warrant and stayed home and then later learned about what you acted on at town meeting, would I have not really have been appropriately noticed of what was going to be acted upon at town meeting? So you're supposed to be able to make a judgment call by looking at the warrant about the subject matter that's going to be discussed at the deliberative session, and then obviously acted on at the polls. And that's just sort of the so-called stay-at-home rule. Really the key is the subject matter appropriately warned. And again, this is as much, even less of an appropriations question as it is just a general warning of subject matter, because as you know, warrant articles are substantially changed at the town meeting, but the key is that the subject matter has remained the same. And that really, again, is not just an appropriations question, it's also just a generic question. And as an aside, petitioned warrant articles can be amended to the same extent that any other warrant article can be amended. So sometimes there's confusion. People think that petitioned warrant articles can't be touched by amendments at the deliberative session, and that is simply not true. The legislative body can still act and amend petitioned warrant articles. So the fourth key concept is no spending without an appropriation. And in a lot of ways, we have really touched upon this, because we said that in order for the select board to have the authority to spend, there must in the first instance be a legislative act and appropriation authorizing the expenditure of that money. But 32 Section 8 says no board of selectmen, school board, village district commissioners, etc., 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 acting as such shall pay or agree to pay any money or incur any liability involving the expenditure of money for any purpose in excess of the amount appropriated by the legislative body for that purpose, or for any purpose for which no appropriation has been made except as provided in, and it lists some other statutes. So the general rule,
I didn't understand that at all.
the general rule is that the select board can only spend this is the general rule, we haven't gotten to all the exceptions, can only spend the amount of money authorized to be spent by the voters. That's the general rule. But we know about transfer authority, and transfer is an exception to the general rule. So the general rule is the voters appropriate money, and that is what the governing body, the select board, has the authority to spend. The other piece to this is the part that says for any purpose for which no appropriation has been made, which also ties into the concept of no means no, which I'm just trying to remind myself if I have a separate slide on, and I don't, so I'm going to talk about it here. So if the voters, and this is really the key to no means no, if there is a separate warrant article to spend money for a particular purpose, and the voters vote no, they reject that warrant article to appropriate money for that particular purpose, or, which is less likely to happen in an SB2 town, they zero out the appropriation so that $0 are appropriated for that particular purpose. The act of voting no on a separate appropriation or zeroing out a separate appropriation equates to you are not authorized to spend money for that purpose. That is the no means no rule that you hear. So if there is a separate warrant article.
Can I give an example?
Sure.
So
then I don't have to think of one.
So let's say that we have a warrant article to sort of repair the second floor of the town hall.
Mm-hmm.
And
so you're going to appropriate X amount of dollars to do some repairs in the second floor.
Yeah, let's say $150,000, and the voters at the deliberative session reduce that to 0.
Yep, and then it goes on the ballot as 0, so there's a $0 appropriation.
Yeah, or it gets
rejected at the ballot. Yep.
So then what I believe you're saying is that the board, even though we might have some money in our maintenance budget for town hall, would not be allowed to use that to work on that second floor. That's what you're saying.
And that is the danger sometimes with separate warrant articles, is that a no vote means no. We don't want you to spend money. Now, the no vote only applies to this budget year. It doesn't carry over until next year. But it is treated as a no to spending money for that purpose. The trickiest part, I think, is that sometimes you get a no vote to repair the second floor of the town hall, and then you say, well, we have a town hall restoration and maintenance capital or non-capital reserve fund, and we have money in there, so we're just going to go ahead and do it anyways, and perhaps your agents to expend on that fund so you don't need the voters to approve it. The tricky question is whether the no means no applies to all expenditures, whether in a pre-established fund or not. Mm-hmm. And I think reasonable attorneys could disagree on that point. I mean, I've certainly argued, well, the fund was pre-established by the voters for a particular purpose, and the agents were made agents to expend, so why can't they spend it? But if no means no really means no for that purpose, for that budget year period, then you would not be authorized. And that is a really tricky question that I pose to you with no answer.
Fair enough. Yeah. And just so you know, the chair of the school board, I think, just walked in.
Oh, excellent. Hello, I'm Margaret. So we said the general rule is you get to spend only what's appropriated, and you get to spend only the amount that the voters appropriated. But then there are about 100 exceptions to that rule, right? The first exception, of course, is transfer authority. And we already said, yes, the budget is posted with the line items, the so-called appropriations, as a certain amount, but the select board can make transfers throughout the year. So that's the big exception to that rule that we just said in 32.8. Legal judgments. You can't, if the town gets sued and there's a judgment against the town, they can't say, oh, we didn't raise and appropriate any money for a legal judgment, so we're not going to pay our legal judgment. That won't fly either. You are legally obligated to find money in order to pay a legal judgment. If you need more money, you had a procedural defect with an appropriation, or you have a situation where you just had a very unanticipated situation and a need for a huge expenditure.
A culvert that failed?
Yep. The Department of Revenue has the authority to grant you the permission to spend. Contracts are an interesting strange situation.